Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture on the course Python Fundamentals Building Blocks for Aspiring Developers. In this lecture, we will start with the ninth module, that is working with external APIs. So this is our agenda. Today we will have a look at what APIs are and how to make requests. Then we will see how we parse JSON data and how we handle responses, and then we'll try and build a simple web scraper. And in the end, we'll have a mini project um, with with external APIs. So let's begin. So the first question is, what is API? So API stands for Application Programming Interface. So it's essentially a set of rules and protocols that allow you to communicate with different applications with different softwares. So it enables developers to access certain features, data sets from a different database, it could be a different service, it could be a different application without needing to understand the underlying code. So, for example, if you have to download some data from the internet, so you go on the website to download the data as a CSV file. Now, in Python, if you want to do the same thing, it is very inconvenient to download the data manually. So sometimes those services or websites that provide data, they also have a API endpoint. So API endpoint is a URL where you make a request. That is, you send a request by Python, like, okay, this is the API endpoint, this is the URL, I need this data, and they will return the data to you in Python, and then you can use that. Now, what happens is that they have already created an API. You cannot change the API. So, for example, if they allow only a certain amount of data to be accessible to the user, like if they have, let's say, a database with, let's say, 1500 features, but they only allow 500 features for the users. So, you cannot change that because the API is developed by that service. You cannot change the API. But the positives here is that you can simply write an URL endpoint and it will get you the data. You do not need to tell that, okay, go into this database, apply this query, fetch this data from here, convert it into this format, and then return it to me. No, that is done by the service itself. That is of no concern to us. We simply send a request and we get the data. We are just limited by the fact that the service that provides the API or the application that provides the API, what functionality have they put in. We cannot exceed that, we cannot make it less. We just have to deal with it. So there are many types of APIs out there, including web APIs, and this is what we will focus on today. So web APIs are most commonly used to communicate with the website to retrieve data from online services. For example, it could be social media data, for example, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit. So all of these mostly have a API. Now some APIs are paid. For example, Twitter has a paid API, that is, you can only use that API. You can only make a request to that API if you have a subscription. Reddit, on the other hand, mostly has free tier API. That is, you can still make some requests, but that is free. That doesn't cost you anything. Similarly, there's a lot of things out there. For example, weather services, financial institutions, and much more. If you search about it, a lot of websites that are dealing with data or providing some service, they do have an API that you can use in programming. So if you look at this image below, this is how you can conceptualize of how an API works. So client in this case is your laptop. Your laptop is the client who is making a request. So they make a request to a REST API. So a REST API or API is the same thing. So you make a request to the API, that is, you type a URL, you say, okay, this is the URL, get me the data, and then the REST API will communicate with the server on its own. You do not need to do anything. In fact, you can't even do anything about that. So it will communicate with the server, fetch the data, format it, restructure it in a proper format, and then return the data to you. So this is how it goes. So how do we use it with Python? So first, let's understand what is HTTP. So HTTP is a protocol, that is hypertext transfer protocol. So it is the foundation of data communication in the world, around the world. You would have seen this in your URLs. Whenever you have a website or anything, you type into Google, you always see this HTTP or HTTPS at the very start of the URL. So these are just some rules or transfer protocols that allow you to communicate with the service more securely. They do not allow your data to be leaked, these kind of things. We do not need to go into detail of this much of what HTTP is, but we need to understand that we make requests via HTTP. HTTP is a part of our requests. Okay, so Python provides a lot of libraries. There's a lot of libraries, packages, modules out there that allow us to make requests. So each of them have different functions. Some are more easy to use, some are more difficult, and so on. But the most popular one, most convenient one, the most used one is called the requests. It's the requests library. Requests is the name of the library. So what it does is that it simplifies the process of making a request. The code is very small and it allows a very convenient way or a very efficient way to handle the responses as well. So the responses in this case would mostly be data that we are fetching. So here's an example. So first to use this module requests, you will have to install it. So we have learned how to install it. We'll simply install it via pip, then we will import it into a code, and finally we will make a request. So the syntax or the function to make a request is requests.get, and within the parentheses you write an API endpoint. So this is like the API endpoint. It tells the service that okay, this is the request that you are making, this is what you want from us, right? And this is a typical response. So after you make a request you will have some response. So with the response, that is basically the data. Then you can use the response, use the data in your own code, do something with it, computations, maybe just display the data, maybe just make visualizations, something of that sort. Now with the response is basically an object, and it has some properties. So for example, it is the status code, headers, and content. We will go into detail of the response in the next lecture, but right now we will see how APIs work and see how we can start that in Python. So let's begin coding. So first of all, what we'll do is we'll go over to VS Code. Here I've written a API endpoint already. So how do you basically find one? So for example, this one is just a fake sort of an API on the web that allows just for you to test it. So what you need to do is you need to go here, and here you can write JSON placeholder, and on the first one it says free fake REST API. So it doesn't really give you any important data. The data is just dummy data. So here you can see this is a way of making a request. Now this is in some other language. This is not in Python, but this is how you send a request and then you can deal with it. But right now, this is what we are concerned about. This. So this is the API endpoint. You can say this over here. Copy, you paste it over here like this. And then you need to tell what you need to fetch. For example, slash posts. So if I write here slash posts, it will get me posts. If I do enter, I should get a lot of posts. This is how data is returned. So this URL, like an API URL, if you copy paste that into a web browser, it will return the data to you. It looks like this, and this is how we will see it in Python. Now, similarly, there's another endpoint that is comments. So maybe we say comments. We get comments right now. This is just a dummy data. This doesn't make sense, but still we have something. Then we have albums, photos, and everything. Now this comments, when we write this, when we send a request, when we hit enter, this is returned from the server. I mean, I cannot change it. I cannot do anything about it until and unless they have some functionality. For example, they have this functionality where I write this. This will only return the first one, right? Let's check if they have for this. Yeah, this will return for ID. So this here is basically the ID. So this is the functionality that they provide. Now in most of the websites, they do have a documentation. For example, this. So they've written this is how our output looks like. This is how if you have multiple outputs. So most of the services that have an API, they will also have a guide page or a documentation page that will allow you to see what kind of a response you get, right? So let's go back, and this is the same API endpoint or URL that I have written, right? I've written posts here. I can change it to comments, anything, but let's just keep it posts, right? But the first thing that we need to do is we need to install requests. So we say pip install requests, hit enter, everything installed. I can quickly check it by writing here Python, and I say import requests. So it doesn't give me an error, which means it has installed correctly. Now when I write here Python, I'm basically in the Python editor, and here I can write code too, but this is just for testing. Clear this. First, what we need to do is that we need to import requests, right? Now we already have the URL defined. Now we simply need to make a request. So we say, let's say response will hold the response of our request, and we say requests dot get, and here we need to put in the URL. So I already have a URL here in this one, in this variable. So I will simply write URL, right? And then I can say print response, right? In the code, and this is what it has printed. It says response 200. Now response is basically an object, and this is what it will print. This is basically a code. We will learn about this in the next lecture. But for now, let's say we want to see the data. So I'll write dot text, save it, run it, and it gives me the data as text, right? So this is basically a text. This is not a JSON, this is a text. It is just printed like a JSON. Now the response.text will basically convert the data into text that we can read. There's also some other functions, but for now we will just stick to this one, and I'll quickly show you the type. It says type is string, which means this is not a JSON, this is a simple string or text format. And this is how you make requests online, right? So it is as simple as this. And that was all in this lecture. We had a little bit of introduction about APIs. You just go there, you see different websites that you use on daily basis and try and see if they have an API, and if you can make an API call, and if you find any sort of documentation that allows you to understand what sort of data do they return, right? So we'll see you in the next one. Up till then, goodbye.